The clipboard hit the metal desk with a sharp crack as the young recruiter leaned back in his government-issued chair, eyeing the woman across from him like she'd wandered in from a grocery store parking lot. "Ma'am, I think you might be in the wrong building," he said, barely suppressing a smirk as his buddies behind him exchanged knowing looks. What happened next would leave this entire recruiting station speechless. And if you want to see how assumptions can crumble in seconds, hit that subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez stood 5'6" in worn Carhartt work boots that had seen better decades. Her graying black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that revealed premature silver threads at her temples. At 47, she carried herself with an economy of movement that spoke of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it mattered. Her olive-toned skin showed the weathering of too many deployments under desert suns, and her dark brown eyes held the kind of stillness that comes from seeing too much too young. She wore a faded black t-shirt that hung loose over well-worn jeans, both chosen for function over form, and her only jewelry was a simple gold band on her ring finger and a small silver cross at her throat. The Army recruiting station in downtown San Antonio buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Monday morning rush. Young men and women in their late teens and early 20s filled out paperwork at small tables, their nervous energy bouncing off the fluorescent-lit walls covered with motivational posters featuring soldiers in dress blues and combat gear. The air conditioning struggled against the Texas heat seeping through windows that faced the parking lot, where Elena's beat-up Ford F-150 sat between two newer vehicles. The smell of industrial coffee mixed with the faint odor of cleaning supplies and fresh copies from an overworked printer. Somewhere in the back, a radio played soft rock at low volume, barely audible over the constant hum of conversation and ringing phones. Elena had come here with a specific purpose, carrying a manila envelope thick with documents that could change the trajectory of several young lives. But first, she had to get past the gatekeepers, who saw only what they expected to see. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, 23, and fresh from his recruiter school at Fort Knox, looked up from his computer screen with the kind of practiced smile he reserved for walk-ins who clearly didn't belong. His crisp Army combat uniform bore only the most basic ribbons, and his high and tight haircut still held the perfect edges that marked someone who hadn't spent enough time in the field to stop caring about regulation appearances. Behind him, Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez and Specialist Ashley Chen continued their conversation about weekend plans, but their attention had shifted to the unexpected visitor. "Ma'am, if you're looking for the community college, that's about 3 blocks east," Rodriguez offered helpfully, his tone carrying the kind of condescension reserved for lost civilians. At 24, he'd completed one deployment to Kuwait, mostly spent on a secure forward operating base, and considered himself a veteran of sorts. His uniform showed a slightly more impressive ribbon rack than Williams', including a combat action badge that he'd earned during a mortar attack that had landed 2 kilometers from his position. Chen, barely 21, and still working on her first enlistment, giggled softly as she shuffled through a stack of recruitment brochures. "Or if you need help with veterans' benefits, the VA office is on the north side of town," she added, assuming the older woman might be seeking assistance for a spouse or relative. Elena stepped closer to Williams's desk, her expression unchanged. She didn't offer the expected smile or show any sign of embarrassment at their assumptions. Instead, she simply placed the manila envelope on the desk's surface, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge of special recruitment initiatives," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested Spanish as a first language, though her English was precise and unaccented. Williams glanced at the envelope, but didn't touch it. "Ma'am, I appreciate your interest, but our age limits are pretty strict. Unless you've got a really specialized skill set, We're typically looking for people in their teens and 20s. He gestured toward the young recruits filling out paperwork. These folks are more what we're targeting for our current needs. The dismissal hung in the air like smoke from a training exercise. Rodriguez leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued by Elena's calm reaction to what should have been an embarrassing moment. Most civilians would have apologized and left by now, but something about her stillness suggested she wasn't going anywhere. "Look, lady," Chen said, standing up from her desk with the authority of someone wearing stripes for the first time. "We've got real applicants to process today. If you want to talk about your son or daughter joining up, you can make an appointment for later in the week." She moved around her desk, positioning herself between Elena and the inner office where Captain James Morrison worked behind a closed door. Elena's gaze shifted to each of them in turn, taking their measure with the kind of assessment that felt uncomfortably thorough. She didn't argue or raise her voice. Instead, she reached for the envelope and began to open it, her fingers working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled countless classified documents under pressure. "Ma'am, you really need to," Williams started, but his words died as Elena pulled up the left sleeve of her t-shirt. The burn scars ran from her wrist to her elbow, creating a pattern of raised, discolored skin that looked like melted wax had been poured over her forearm and allowed to harden. But it wasn't the scars that made Williams's breath catch in his throat. It was the tattoo beneath them, partially obscured but still clearly visible, the distinctive trident and eagle of the Navy SEALs, surrounded by dates and coordinates that only someone with deep knowledge of special operations would recognize. The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Rodriguez straightened in his chair, his casual demeanor evaporating as he registered what he was seeing. Chen took an unconscious step backward, her hand dropping from the position she'd held at her hip. Elena rolled up her right sleeve next, revealing more scars and another tattoo, the crossed arrows and dagger of Army Special Forces, with a ribbon beneath it that read 5th SFG, and dates spanning nearly 2 decades. Between the tattoos, surgical scars created a roadmap of injuries sustained in places that didn't appear on most maps. From the documents in the envelope, Elena pulled out a military identification card, its holographic security features catching the fluorescent light. She placed it on Williams's desk, next to a set of orders that bore classification stamps and signatures from generals whose names appeared regularly in defense publications. Rodriguez was the first to find his voice. "Holy shit," he whispered, then immediately looked around to make sure Captain Morrison hadn't heard him curse in front of a visitor. But his profanity was more prayer than transgression, an acknowledgement that he was looking at something far beyond his experience or understanding. Chen sank back into her chair, her face flushing red as the implications of their treatment began to settle in. She'd been in the Army for 18 months and had never seen anything like the documentation spread across Williams's desk. The ID card showed Elena's rank as Chief Warrant Officer 4, a position that required decades of specialized expertise, and her military occupational specialty was listed with a code that Chen didn't recognize but suspected she wasn't cleared to know about anyway. Williams picked up the ID card with trembling fingers, checking the holographic features and security elements with the thoroughness of someone who'd been trained to spot fakes. Everything was genuine, from the embedded chip to the biometric data encoded in the magnetic strip. But more than the card's authenticity, it was Elena's patient stillness that convinced him they'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. The inner office door opened with a sharp click, and Captain Morrison stepped out, drawn by the unusual silence that had replaced the morning's routine chatter. James Morrison was 41. A career infantry officer who'd commanded companies in both Iraq and Afghanistan before transitioning to recruiting duty. His combat infantryman badge and Bronze Star medal were visible among the ribbons on his chest, and his bearing suggested someone who'd earned his authority through blood and mud rather than just time in service. "What's the situation out here?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the command presence that had kept soldiers alive in places where mistakes were measured in body bags. His gaze took in the frozen tableau, his junior staff looking like they'd seen a ghost, and an older civilian woman standing calmly beside a desk covered with military documents. Williams held up the ID card without speaking, his hand still shaking slightly as Morrison stepped closer to examine it. The captain's expression shifted through several phases as he processed what he was seeing: confusion, recognition, and finally something approaching awe. "Chief Warrant Officer Vasquez," Morrison said, his voice dropping to the respectful tone reserved for addressing senior personnel. "Ma'am, I apologize for any inconvenience my staff may have caused." He shot a look at his subordinates that promised a conversation they wouldn't enjoy. "How can we assist you today?" Elena gathered her documents with the same unhurried precision she'd shown in revealing them. "I'm here about the selection process for the 75th Ranger Regiment's new recruitment initiative," she said, her voice carrying no trace of the irritation she would have been justified in feeling. "I've been tasked with evaluating potential candidates for specialized training programs." Morrison's eyes widened slightly as the pieces fell into place. The 75th Ranger Regiment's recruitment had been struggling to find candidates with the mental toughness and adaptability required for modern special operations. The solution had been to bring in evaluators with real-world experience, people who could see past surface appearances to identify the qualities that mattered when bullets started flying. "Ma'am, I had no idea you were coming today," Morrison said, shooting another glare at Williams, who was frantically checking his computer for missed communications. "We should have been prepared to receive you properly." Elena shook her head slightly. "The evaluation begins the moment I walk through the door, Captain. Your staff's initial reaction tells me everything I need to know about their ability to recognize potential in unexpected packages." She looked at each of the junior enlisted personnel in turn, her expression neutral but not unkind. "The same mistake they made with me, they'll make with recruits who don't fit their preconceived notions of what a warrior looks like." Rodriguez found his voice, though it came out hoarse with embarrassment. "Ma'am, we had no way of knowing." "Exactly," Elena interrupted gently. "You had no way of knowing, so you made assumptions based on appearance and age. In the field, that kind of thinking gets people killed." She gestured toward the young recruits still filling out paperwork, most of whom had been watching the drama unfold with growing interest. "How many potential Rangers are you turning away because they don't look like what you expect a soldier to look like?" Morrison nodded grimly, understanding the lesson being delivered to his staff. "Ma'am, if you'd like to conduct your evaluation in my office, we can provide you with whatever resources you need." He paused, then added with genuine curiosity, "If you don't mind me asking, what brought you to recruiting evaluation? Your background suggests you could write your own ticket anywhere in the special operations community." Elena's expression softened almost imperceptibly, revealing for the first time a hint of the person beneath the professional exterior. "I spent 22 years in places where I couldn't talk about what I was doing or who I was doing it with," she said, her voice taking on a reflective quality. "Now I want to help identify the people who can handle that kind of responsibility. Not the ones who look the part, but the ones who can actually do the job when everything goes sideways." She walked over to where a young man sat hunched over his application, his thin frame and thick glasses marking him as someone who'd probably been overlooked by other recruiters. Elena studied his paperwork over his shoulder, noting his perfect ASVAB scores and his background in computer engineering. "What's your name, son?" she asked. "Kevin Martinez, ma'am," the young man replied, looking up with surprise at being addressed by someone who wasn't in uniform. "Tell me about the hardest thing you've ever done, Kevin," Elena said, pulling up a chair beside him. "Not physically, but mentally. When have you had to push through something that made you want to quit?" Martinez glanced nervously at the recruiters, then back to Elena. "Ma'am, I don't know if it's really that impressive, but I taught myself programming when my family couldn't afford classes. It took me 3 years, working nights after my regular job, to get good enough to land an engineering position. He shrugged self-consciously. My mom was sick, and we needed the money, so quitting wasn't really an option. Elena nodded approvingly. 3 years of self-directed study while working full-time and dealing with family stress. That's the kind of mental resilience we're looking for. She turned to Morrison, who had been listening intently. This young man has already demonstrated more mental toughness than most people show in a lifetime. But I'll bet your standard recruiters would focus on his physical appearance and miss what matters. Chen, who had been listening with growing shame, stepped forward hesitantly. Ma'am, how can we get better at seeing what you see? Elena stood and walked back to the desk, where her documents still lay scattered. You start by remembering that the most dangerous operators I've ever worked with looked like people you'd pass on the street without a second glance. The guy who saved my life in Kandahar was a 43-year-old master sergeant who looked like somebody's uncle. The intelligence officer who prevented a massacre in Syria was a woman who could have been a kindergarten teacher. She paused, letting the words sink in. Warriors don't all look like action movie heroes, and the ones who do often crack under real pressure. Morrison moved to address his staff directly, his command voice filling the small office. Staff Sergeant Williams, you and your team will be attending a seminar on unconscious bias and proper assessment techniques. Chief Warrant Officer Vasquez has just provided you with a master class in why our recruitment numbers aren't meeting special operations standards. He turned back to Elena with genuine respect. Ma'am, would you be willing to work with us on developing better evaluation protocols? Elena began gathering her documents, sliding them back into the manila envelope with practiced efficiency. I'll be here for the next 2 weeks, Captain. My job is to identify candidates who have what it takes for ranger selection, regardless of what they look like walking through that door. She gestured toward Martinez, who was still processing the conversation that had unfolded around him. Kevin here just became my first recommendation for the pipeline. Not because he's physically impressive, but because he's already proven he can endure hardship for something bigger than himself. Williams, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally found the courage to speak. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We were completely out of line, and I take full responsibility for the disrespectful treatment you received. Elena looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Staff Sergeant, the apology I need isn't for me. It's for every potential recruit you've underestimated based on appearance. It's for every warrior you've missed because they didn't fit your mental image of what strength looks like. She paused, then added with something approaching warmth. But the fact that you recognize the mistake means you can learn from it. That's more than some people manage. Rodriguez stepped forward, his earlier cockiness replaced by genuine humility. Ma'am, is there anything we can do to help with your evaluation process? Any way we can make up for starting off on the wrong foot? You can start by looking at every applicant as if they might be the person who saves your life someday, Elena replied. Because in this business, they very well might be. As Elena prepared to leave, Morrison walked her toward the door, his demeanor that of a junior officer receiving guidance from a senior mentor. Chief, I have to ask. The scars on your arms, are you comfortable sharing how that happened? Elena paused at the threshold, her hand on the door frame. IED in Fallujah, 2007. I was pulling a wounded Marine out of a burning vehicle when the secondary charge went off. She rolled down her sleeves, covering the evidence of that day. The Marine lived to become a father of 3 and a police officer in Ohio. The scars were worth it. The recruiting station remained quiet for several minutes after Elena's departure, the weight of the encounter settling over everyone present. Martinez continued working on his application with renewed confidence, occasionally glancing up to catch encouraging nods from the staff who had witnessed his unexpected validation. Chen was the first to break the silence. "I can't believe we almost turned away someone like that," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "How many other people have we missed?" Williams looked up from his computer, where he'd been researching Elena's background through official channels. What he found there: redacted mission reports, commendations from 3 different combat theaters, and a service record that read like a textbook on special operations, only reinforced the magnitude of their initial mistake. "The question isn't how many we've missed," Morrison said, settling into his chair with the weariness of someone who'd just learned an uncomfortable truth about his own assumptions. "The question is how many we're going to find, now that we know what we're really looking for." Through the window, they could see Elena's beat-up Ford pulling out of the parking lot, blending seamlessly into the morning traffic. She'd arrived as an unknown quantity and departed as a reminder that the most important battles are often won by people nobody expected to be warriors in the first place. The lesson Elena Vasquez left behind that morning wasn't just about respecting veterans or recognizing hidden credentials. It was about understanding that strength comes in forms that don't always announce themselves, and that the person sitting quietly in the corner might be the one who stands when everyone else falls down. In a world that often values appearance over substance and noise over competence, she reminded a room full of recruiters that the most dangerous assumption you can make is that you know what courage looks like. Have you ever witnessed someone being completely underestimated, only to discover they were extraordinary? Share your stories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes who walk among us. These are the people who serve in shadows and sacrifice without recognition, and their stories deserve to be told. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's honor the veterans who continue to serve long after they've hung up the uniform.